not far from Paris, a chateau called Malmaison. In 1799, it became part of history, bought, renovated, and given to his wife Josephine by the new First Consul of France, Napoleon. It was all in the most up-to-date classical taste, with works of art to match. From the Salon of 1806, there came to Malmaison a painting by a certain Pierre Bergeret, a painting of the death of Raphael. A fanciful reconstruction of a famous scene. At the head of his bed, Raphael's last painting, The Transfiguration. His friends gathered round him. In the centre, the Duke of Urbino. Marcantonio Raimondi, the famous engraver. Count Baldassare Castiglione, suitably anguished, and even Pope Leo X at Raphael's bedside. It had all happened 300 years before, on the 6th of April, 1520, in Rome. Raphael had been buried with great pomp in the Pantheon, of all the monuments of ancient Rome, the building he had loved best. In later centuries, only royalty could be buried here. He was kept company by kings. The halo of immortality sits differently on different artists. Raphael's was instant and enduring. He became part of the cultural consciousness of Europe. They called him the Divine Raphael. No artist has been quite so famous or quite so influential for quite so long. Today, when he is not so revered as he used to be, it is difficult to appreciate that for 3.5 centuries his very name stood for an ideal, for perfection itself. He was so idolized he became almost unreal, a kind of saint. Legend accumulated round him. At one point there was even being exhibited in Rome what amounted to a sacred relic. Early in the 19th century the matter became a question of international concern. Was Raphael's body actually in his tomb? For the so-called relic that was on display was said to be his skull. In 1833, with a special dispensation from the Pope and amid widespread publicity, his tomb in the Pantheon was opened. In attendance was the papal legate, numerous dignitaries, and even the professor of anatomy from Rome University. But what they unearthed was the skeleton intact. It even showed that the larynx had been unusually large, so Raphael's voice had been resonant and deep. Replicas of the skull made no effect whatsoever on the popular conception of Raphael as young, delicate, and vulnerable. Here, in his own birthplace, the local Raphael Academy had a sculpture of him as a boy. It was the kind of image the 19th century adored, the angel child of genius. But he was really more like this, as portrayed in his early 30s by his engraver friend Marcantonio Raimondi. And this is a later engraving of a self-portrait of Raphael, which seems at last to have been lost. The obsession which people had about this man was fed by one curious feature of his tomb. Opposite the bust of him was an epitaph to a certain Maria Bibbiena, and above the epitaph, an empty niche. Maria had been the niece of Raphael's friend and patron, the Cardinal Dovizio da Bibbiena, a painting of the story by Ingres. The cardinal wanted his niece to marry Raphael, who might, according to rumour, have been made a cardinal himself. Such things were not unknown. But somehow the intended bridegroom kept delaying the marriage, and in the end the unfortunate Maria died before him. Legend insisted she had had a rival, Raphael's famous mistress, La Faunarina. This is Ingres again, continuing the story. As many fantasies gathered round La Faunarina as they did round Raphael himself, but they gave an appealing humanity to the perfect painter. For centuries, this bold-eyed beauty was thought to be his own portrait of his favourite mistress. More probably, it is by a pupil, and not of La Faunarina at all. No matter, what lived was the legend, and this portrait fed the legend. The youthful Raphael is shown here with the patron saint of artists, St. Luke, which is why this rather unlikable painting was also long revered as his. For Raphael had been the incarnation of a precious heritage, which justified his legend and his reputation, and the name of it was the classical tradition. In 1863, when Manet shocked Paris with Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, hardly anyone noticed at first that this painting was in the same classical tradition. Manet's inspiration was this design by Raphael, and Raphael's inspiration had been the sculpture of ancient Greece and Rome. He had redefined the classical tradition and given it a new lease of life. He had revitalized a fund of visual imagery which was still important to Manet in the 19th century, and through Raphael could be traced back to its source in the inspiration of antiquity. We are in a room in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, the Tribuna. In the 18th century, they called it the most famous room in the world, and it was famous because it was a treasure house of the classical tradition. Its collection of statues and paintings had been built up by the Medici family, and connoisseurs of classical taste would gather here as a high point of their cultural pilgrimage through Europe, called the Grand Tour. A founder member of the English Royal Academy, Johann Zoffany, spent 8 years painting this view of the Tribuna, and he finished it in 1780. There are no less than 5 Raphaels in this room. The Englishman Lord Cooper examines one which he later bought. Sir John the Baptist is nowadays considered a doubtful Raphael. But not the Madonna of the Goldfinch, nor the equally famous one which is shown nearby, the Madonna della Sedia. In this classical context, Raphael's presence is recognized as crucial. The most celebrated antique statue in the room was the Medici Venus. To 18th century eyes, she was perfection itself, the most beautiful female nude in the world. She hardly rates as that today, and Raphael himself never knew her. But he was felt to be the first painter who had understood such beauty. He had shown how to recapture that ideal of physical splendor which lay at the very roots of classical art. Malmaison is only 20 years later than Zoffany's painting of the Tribuna, but here classical taste has taken a slightly different turning. This is Napoleon's study, and what it reflects is neoclassical style as a reminder of the sterner virtues of antiquity, the spur to fame, the mirror of the man of destiny. Napoleon had returned from his Italian campaigns impressed by classical art as the world's most prestigious loot. The original of the Belvedere Apollo was in his baggage train when he returned to Paris. It had been taken from the Vatican. So was the Laocoon, and carted across the Alps among 80 wagon loads of cultural treasure. The Belvedere torso came with them, and so too did at least 12 world-famous Raphaels. After Waterloo, these treasures returned home, but not before the Transfiguration had been coated with a layer of yellow-tinted varnish. From 1800 until only 10 years ago, the world knew Raphael's last painting almost unrecognizably subdued. That was only one problem when paintings got dispersed. Another was that a Raphael original like this got easily confused with all the copies of it. While the galleries of the world were enriched, it sometimes became more difficult to understand Raphael in his proper context. Today, not a single altarpiece of his remains in the church or in the position for which he originally intended it. Pictures got repainted. There were once angels in the sky above this Holy Family. There may once have been a landscape behind the Granduca Madonna. Behind this one, an arcade was painted out and a window added. It was not that people cared too little about Raphael, but that they cared too much. They copied and recopied his paintings, and if he seemed not quite as classical as they felt he ought to be, they corrected him. And sometimes they too diligently cleaned a painting and distorted Raphael's intention that way. Neoclassical taste as a setting for Raphael. A house in St. James's Square in London, designed by Robert Adam and completed in 1774. The owner of the house, Sir Watkin Williams Wynne, was a noted patron of the arts. He wanted a great classical painting as the centerpiece of Adam's classical design. On the advice of Sir Joshua Reynolds, an artist was sent to Rome to make a full-scale copy of Raphael's Transfiguration. That copy was damaged during the last war, but the pattern of the 1770s was meticulously reenacted in the 1970s. Again, an artist went to Rome, Theodore Ramos, to study Raphael's own methods and approach from the original in the Vatican. It had only recently been cleaned, the yellow varnish of 1800 and the accumulated dirt of 4 centuries finally removed. There can be few examples in our own time more closely mirroring how Raphael's work was made familiar wherever classical tastes prevailed. Raphael made this drawing for a rather similar purpose. It was a design for Marcantonio Raimondi to work from in order to make this engraving, The Massacre of the Innocents. Engravings were to be a crucial factor in the spread of Raphael's fame, and he was one of the first artists to recognize their value and to exploit it. Artists who had never seen his paintings could catch the power of his design from an engraving. The dramatic diagonal of this woman's gesture, for example, is it too much to sense an echo of it in the opposite diagonal of this painting? Picasso knew his Raphael. In Guernica, terror and death had descended from the skies, but it was still a massacre of the innocents. Watch here for the small square of light above the screaming woman. Powerful images work themselves into the bloodstream of art, to be passed on from generation to generation, a kind of visual genetics. How that process works, I saw for myself when I was shown this collection of Raphael reproductions in the British Museum. One of the earliest collections of its kind, it was assembled by Queen Victoria's consort, Prince Albert, working with his catalogue of Rouland in the 1840s and 50s.
There we are.
So how many of these volumes did Albert build up into the whole collection in the end?
About 50. It's a sizable collection of material, as you can see.
And there is supposedly Raphael himself, is it not?
That's right. But when Rouland compiled his catalogue, this painting was not considered to be of Raphael himself, but simply described as a young man. This is rather strange because it is said that Prince Albert believed that this was Raphael himself.
His faith has been justified.
His faith has been justified, yes.
There was a whole collection of supposed portraits alone, and this is one extraordinary one.
Not a very pleasing object at all, but it was the Prince Consort's policy to include amongst these prints and photographs works which were ascribed to Raphael.
And now here we have one of the cases of how transmission by engravings affected Raphael imagery, don't we?
Yes, that's quite right. This is a photograph of the painting of La Velata, as it's called. The sitter is believed to have been one of Raphael's mistresses. In the early 17th century in England, there was in the collection of Lord Arundel a version of this picture showing this woman as St. Catherine. And you see here the wheel and the martyr's palm, and she's holding a book. The painting has disappeared, but this is the only surviving record of it, a print by Hollar. Prints very often reverse the images of the pictures or drawings that they reproduce, and that is, I think it's a fair assumption to believe that the lost painting, if it existed, was in the opposite direction.
So has this collection really been of scholastic use in modern times?
Oh yes, very definitely. It's so convenient to use. All the material is here. You don't have to write off to different museums for photographs of drawings because they're sitting in this collection already.
This page compares various versions of the now disputed portrait of La Fornarina. But sometimes the mere seed of an idea by Raphael could bear rich and unexpected fruit. The figure of a woman, one of the studio models perhaps, resting between posing sessions and sketched by Raphael. Marc Antonio saw the sketch, engraved it, and added an angel in the sky. 50 years later, the image reappeared like this. The angel has been redesigned to tell a different story, but now it is a painting by Veronese, the Vision of St. Helena. In the loggia of the Vatican, Raphael had worked with a team of assistants, 10 of them at least, who form what is known as Raphael's workshop. Towards the end of his life, they were not only carrying out his designs under his supervision, but highly skilled as they were, they sometimes did the actual designing themselves. The loggia was Raphael's conception, and for later centuries that was guarantee enough. It became a rich source of Raphael-inspired imagery. Over 50 scenes carried out by the workshop, but famous for over 300 years as Raphael's Bible. They were familiar everywhere, copied and engraved again and again, often very badly, often printed the wrong way round. Even poor reproduction, though, couldn't stop the ideas getting through. Here's Joseph, tempted by Potiphar's wife, boldly re-dramatized by Rembrandt, but still recognizable. These images from the loggia stuck in the mind, a store of basic recipes to be flavored to taste, a visual memory bank to be drawn on by artists as far apart as Rembrandt was from Jacques-Louis David. As David said, I felt that to proceed like the ancients and like Raphael was to be a true artist. David could have seen Raphael's design of the Battle of Ostia when he was in Rome for 6 years, a convert to classicism at the age of 30. He returned to Paris and made his name in 1785 with the Oath of the Horatii. But the richest source of imagery was Raphael's tapestry designs. They told a series of stories with memorable clarity, wordless dramas acted out with a wealth of characterization and apt but simple gestures. So long as painting was about telling stories without words, so long did Raphael seem the exemplary master of that art. Several sets of the tapestries were woven and were widely distributed, so they were widely known. This is from one which hangs today in the Ducal Palace in Raphael's birthplace, Urbino. But the original set hung in the Sistine Chapel in Rome and would have been well known to Nicolas Poussin. This is his severely classical version of Christ's charge to Peter, and he almost has to force himself to tell the story slightly differently from Raphael, with a more pointed emphasis. The miraculous draught of fishes, that too lodged in artists' minds, particularly gestures like this, and the relationship of Andrew and Peter to Christ. This coloured woodcut of it was being printed in Raphael's own lifetime. A century later, Reubens takes up the subject. Even this detail is in Raphael, though Reubens gives the figures and the composition his own surging Baroque rhythm. Forward another century and a half to the American painter John Singleton Copley. A drawing ascribed to Raphael in the 18th century of a fight with a sea monster inspired the central incident of Brooke Watson and the shark, and we have seen already this gesture of the rescuers. (1771) and The Death of General Wolfe by Benjamin West. West also was an American, and this famous scene was a turning point in narrative history painting, the first classical Raphaelesque grouping to be dressed in contemporary costume. West became the second president of the Royal Academy in London, and he was called the American Raphael. Each of the tapestries employed a different narrative approach, with a range of gesture and grouping and expression which was like a pattern book of possibilities. There are over 80 major figures in the whole set and more than 100 faces, and the gestures range from the calm and contained to tense drama and violent action. Rembrandt looked at Raphael longer and harder than almost anyone. He would not have known the original tapestry designs, but he continually fed his own imagination with images like these, for in his studio he had 3 volumes of Raphael prints. Raphael's The Blinding of Elymas translates into Rembrandt's The Blindness of Tobit. Nowadays we are almost too familiar with Raphael's repertoire of gesture. It has been plundered so often by painters looking for drama. But at one time it was startlingly new. Even as independent a spirit as Caravaggio could not resist it. As a language for narrative, it was purpose-built, flexible, cogent, and terse. A portrait by Titian. Raphael may even have known it. In 1639, this painting, with its richly textured sleeve in the foreground, came up for sale in Amsterdam. And so in the same year did Raphael's most influential portrait, in many ways so like it, his Castiglione. Rembrandt sketched the Castiglione at the sale. He noted the date, 1639. Also the price, 3,500 guilders. But even as he sketched, he started changing the hat, changing the face, turning it into an idea for another portrait, a portrait of himself. The Raphael fused with the Titian in his mind, and so through Rembrandt there was absorbed into the European tradition a classic type of half-length portrait. Rembrandt saw a Raphael Madonna as an essentially intimate domestic image. Others saw the transcendental Catholic side of his religious art. This is Correggio, setting a whole dome alight with ideas from Raphael's Transfiguration. Classical clarity is thrown to the winds in a swirl of clouds and limbs and drapery, for Correggio anticipates the Baroque, but he is also the artist who first exploits the charm and the sentiment of the Raphael Madonna and Child. 3 centuries later, Ingres, the last of the great Raphael devotees, pays homage to his idol in the grand manner. This is Raphael extolled as the master of pure form. The model is partly Raphael's Madonna di Foligno and partly the Sistine Madonna. But with his almost chilling classical correctness, Ingres misses the very quality that made Raphael the 19th century's most beloved religious painter. He spoke with easy grace to popular sentiment. When photography was first struggling to be art, it could turn to Raphael for credentials. These are studies by the pioneer photographer Julia Margaret Cameron. The classical idea always returns to Rome. A garden there called the Bosco Parnassio in honor of Apollo. They performed plays here in the tiny amphitheatre in the 1720s. They held concerts, discussed literature and art. Above all, they pledged themselves to preserve the classical purity of the Italian tongue. They called themselves the Arcadian Academy. Their gatherings were held in one of the earliest of neoclassical interiors, built in 1725. Raphael would have recognized the idea of an academy. His own circle at the papal court discussed culture and the classics in exactly the same spirit. What were the highest forms of art? What were the best examples to follow? In time, academies became institutionalized. High art became defined by rules, the right rules for composing music or poetry, a painting or a statue. It was a way of maintaining standards, of promoting an ideal. The life class of the Royal Academy schools in London. Academies are not in the first instance teaching institutions, but teaching very early became part of their aim. The academic ideal in art has always been that classical example defines the rules, but the rules are vitalized by study from the life. That had been Raphael's own practice.
What you need to do, in fact, is to come from the pit of the neck down to the navel at an angle which is a bit more like that. And this navel is a little bit higher up in relation to that, but still this change in angle is significant, isn't it? Then when you have got to the navel, the axis from there down to the bottom of the abdomen turns quite sharply that way. I feel that this is stated rather too weakly, and that in fact you would finish up with the bottom of the abdomen much too far close to the wrist. Yeah. The other thing I would say is that this boundary which you marked so clearly down here on the head is significant, I think, down to the bottom of the cheek there, but then it runs back too quickly to the line of the jaw, like that. I mean, it starts with these two structural points on the zygomatic arch and comes down like that to the point of the chin. What you've tended to do there is to draw it that way, like that.
Life drawing presupposes that the human figure is the central and staple subject of art. And as long as that priority was unquestioned, Raphael and the classical tradition remained at the heart of what was and is taught at the academies. But can they be reconciled to the very different priorities of art in our own time?
We can learn an awful lot from him. But
how does Raphael look to students at the Royal Academy schools today?
We've got to absorb all these various influences. You can't turn your back on everything that's gone before you and try to be original. There's too much of this being original nowadays. It's important to assimilate what's gone on behind you, and only then can you evolve your own artistic language.
I mean, I'm wondering why have you selected this one as something special?
I like the middle period Raphael, the type of painting that seems to emulate the Michelangelo. They're very pastel colours. I like them very much because they're not bright like the very early paintings. There is a sort of restraint in the colour, which I find modernistic, I must say. There is an almost freedom to the colour, which I think is important. He isn't restrained by this old master approach. I also like the design. There's a freedom of design, especially in the Galatea picture, where he seems to take the rhythms of the figures and develop them in a very personalized way. They are painted, you could say, stylistically similarly to Michelangelo, but they have very much a sensitivity towards a personal vision, which is totally Raphael's, and to that extent, I find him very interesting.
Working in the studio, I've often looked at that picture and I've done some drawings of it, just in the space, because in the studio itself, I've done a lot of paintings about the studio. And we've got a similar type of architecture in the schools, which, classical, you could say in some ways, which reverberates in that painting. And the use of the figures in the space is very interesting. But I don't think any modern painters come close to using figures like that now.
This drawing from the antique, which is something that seemed to come, I don't know, maybe after Raphael, and it was picked up by the academy schools. It's something I just can't come to terms with. Drawing from the antique, that kind of classical approach, for me, is something that's dead. I think it's misconstruing Raphael's motives. Raphael drew as a means of putting a painting together. I think his drawings convey very specific emotions.
Raphael's drawings have been prized and studied among artists particularly, almost more than his paintings. They are the way in to the processes of his creative imagination, the revelation of how the classicizing vision has to be nourished on the study of reality and life. But they still leave certain problems unresolved for the artist today. Problems of what tradition is, and whether this tradition has any further lessons to pass on.
We found at the beginning of the century and the end of the last, artists trying to assert a new reality, a new and fresh way of reading nature. If we now look back, we will find that, of course, in the tradition derived from Giotto and Masaccio, that we are in a way set in Raphael's position. We have the choice of pursuing the pursuits of post-war artists or post-Cézanne artists to develop painting into so many different ways, whether it be surrealism, cubism, or whatever. And in a way, we have this terrible problem of whether we are ourselves going to become mannered or eclectic, with such a strong 20th century tradition to pursue and follow.
That very ability to reinterpret the past attracted students of architecture to Raphael. He left one major project unfinished at his death, not a painting, but an environment, a high Renaissance evocation of gracious living in the palmiest days of ancient Rome. It is called the Villa Madama, and it was planned to be twice its present size. It is set among garden terraces, pools and fountains, one of them of an elephant, surely Pope Leo X's famous elephant Hanno, whose funeral portrait Raphael had painted in the great court of the Vatican. The Villa Madama is again a Raphael concept carried out by his collaborators and assistants, and they crowned their work with the decoration of its great loggia. Raphael was already dead when these panels were painted, but his workshop still owned the vast collection of his unused drawings, designs, and sketchbooks. Interior decoration was influenced for centuries by this Roman practice of mixing colour and relief, painting and stucco work. Raphael had not only been the leading authority of his day on Roman architecture, He was himself a practicing architect who made the classical idiom fashionable. People came to him for a new villa or a new palazzo in the approved classical revival style. Only two certain examples remain today, this one in Rome itself. And even so, the Palazzo Vidoni Caparelli may partly have been built by Giulio Romano, his pupil and assistant. But the heavy rustication is in his style and the steady rhythmic beat of the facade. It is authentically Roman, correct, and sober. His other surviving design is in Florence, the Palazzo Pandolfini. The most influential Italian architect of the next generation, Andrea Palladio, knew and admired Raphael's work. And it is through Palladio that Raphael's architecture made its own contribution to the classical idiom of Europe. The classical Italian villa was made for the classical Mediterranean climate, but it was too elegant a concept to be left for only Latin countries to enjoy. We are in England, on the Isle of Wight. The time is the 1840s, and here, if anywhere, the full 19th century apotheosis of Raphael finds its grandest, indeed its most royal expression. Osborne House, a country villa designed to evoke the spirit of the divine painter, his art, his fame, even his architectural style. A house attuned to a new taste for the classical. It was a country retreat for Queen Victoria, but the passion for Raphael was Prince Albert's. He set the style and devised the setting. In his private sanctum, among other mementos of his interests, both domestic and cultural, Raphael, like a member of the family, above the carving of a royal baby's hand. In the billiard room, one of those charming absurdities the 19th century invented about Raphael, why he might have had to paint the Madonna della Sedia in a circle. The furniture in the drawing room inlaid with porcelain plaques after Raphael. The side of the piano decorated with them. The portrait of a violinist at that time still attributed to the master. Copied on porcelain also, the young queen, as if through Raphael's eyes. And in the bedroom, a Madonna by an artist who shared Prince Albert's enthusiasm, an artist who linked the English pre-Raphaelites with an influential Raphaelite movement in Germany. His name was William Dyce. Dyce had been to Rome, Prince Albert had known Rome also before his marriage, and he knew its art. But this was Rome at the height of the Romantic movement, the Rome of Shelley and Keats, a Rome swarming with foreign poets and painters, where not flower sellers but artists' models foregathered daily on the Spanish steps. It was the heyday also of the Café Greco. Goethe came here, Byron came here, and it was the haunt of artists. And in the flood tide of Romanticism, the image of Rome changed, and with it, the classical ideal. Among the habitués of the Café Greco in the 1820s was a group of German painters called the Nazarenes. Like other foreign artists who paid their bills with paintings, they had made Rome their headquarters. They were classicists of a new kind, and they looked at Raphael in a new spirit. The Triumph of Religion in the Arts by Friedrich Overbeck. To the Nazarenes, Rome was not the classical city, it was the holy city. And art was an expression of Christian piety. That was to become a very popular 19th century attitude. Raphael, dressed in white, was for them a religious artist at the crowning point of a Christian tradition dating back to Charlemagne. Like many fundamentalists, they were rather muddle-headed, but they were quite sure that only art up to the High Renaissance had been pure in style and pure in soul. They rediscovered what had long been overlooked, Raphael's early paintings like the Entombment, and they tried, however clumsily, to emulate a youthful, romantic sentiment they found there. In 1819 they began one of the major decorative achievements of the 19th century, the still little known and neglected frescoes in 3 rooms of the Casino Massimo. This was the Nazarene style which was to influence in France the clear, clean line of Ingres, and in England pre-Raphaelite painters like Millet. The poet Tasso introduces the theme of one room, scenes from his romantic epic Jerusalem Delivered. Epic themes on an epic scale. That was the aim. And the Nazarenes looked to Raphael to guide them, the Raphael of the great narrative frescoes in the Vatican, like the Heliodorus and the Mass at Bolsena. On the ceiling, a Raphaelesque figure of Jerusalem Delivered. Christian allegory, Christian endeavor, but told, as the poem is, in a spirit of heroic adventure and high romance, like the interlude of the warrior maiden Erminia among the shepherds. This scene is by Overbeck. Others are by Joseph Furey. In the clash of Crusaders and Saracens, romantic love triumphs on the battlefield. Rinaldo meets Armida disguised as a Christian knight. A second room and another epic romance, Ariosto's Orlando Furioso. The greatest paladin of Charlemagne's army, driven mad by love to discover that Angelica has married his Moorish rival, Medoro. Echoes of Raphael's Parnassus, setting a mood of pastoral idyll. The artist this time is Schnorr von Karosfeld. Eventually, Orlando will come to the rescue of Christendom in peril. The Saracens are besieging Paris and have driven Charlemagne's army back behind the city walls. Raphael's ingenuity in the Vatican in fitting a fresco round awkward windows and doorways has been ingeniously adopted here. In the space beyond, Charlemagne's army rallies to the counterattack. The figure of a fleeing woman from Raphael's Burning of the Borgo. The Nazarenes made a practice of studying Raphael daily at the Vatican or the Villa Farnesina, with a very northern devotion to the classical Italian south. But they studied him also with a sense of mission which they were to carry back with them to Germany. A mission about the role of fresco painting in high art. Only fresco, they argued, could supply the scale demanded of the greatest themes, Christian themes and moral subjects. But by the 1820s, fresco had been neglected for nearly half a century. The Nazarenes relearned the almost forgotten technique of tracing and painting a large-scale design direct into the wet plaster of a wall. Their ideas caught the imagination of their fellow countryman, Prince Albert, and also of William Dyce. And so it was that they reached England and Osborne House. Dyce's fresco was visible from the nursery floor, where the staff were shocked at quite so much nudity within sight of the children. The Queen, however, had approved the design. The subject was Britannia accepting the empire of the waves from Neptune. The style is Nazarene, the tone Victorian at its most fulsome, but among the waves are sea gods from Raphael's Galatea. But by now there is something faintly absurd in this straining for an effect which no longer comes naturally. Technically, the fresco is extremely skillful, but as elsewhere in Europe, academic painting was being forced into an outdated role. It was becoming pretentious. As the Nazarenes had foreseen, the 19th century had a demanding sense of high art for high occasion. Amid the Gothic splendors of the Queen's robing room in the House of Lords, Raphael was adapted again. The artist again is William Dyce. The title, Religion. And the inspiration is Raphael's fresco in the Vatican called the Disputa, whose subject is also the triumph of Christian faith. The homage is outright and, in its way, sincere, but it is almost the last time Raphael could be called on to serve this role in public art. He had done so for 3 centuries, but now the great gear change of modern history had begun, in society, in politics, not least in culture. Even while Prince Albert encouraged the scheme to fresco the Houses of Parliament, in France the Impressionists were painting a new kind of picture which would make allegorical narrative like this irrelevant. Dyce's defeated king is Raphael's figure of the dying Ananias. We are no longer equipped to pay that kind of tribute, even if we believed in it, and perhaps only the 19th century could. In 1861, Prince Albert himself died. As he and the Queen had already planned, a private mausoleum was built at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle. and at the Queen's wish, it was designed as Osborne House had been designed, to reflect the art and style and memory of the artist Prince Albert had regarded as the greatest of all time. Above the altar, from Raphael's drawings, a version of his Resurrection of Christ. Adapted from a Raphael fresco in Santa Maria della Pace in Rome, the figure of the prophet Isaiah rendered in marble. Across the aisle, another of Daniel, and from the same fresco, Solomon. Over the entrance door, a copy of Raphael's fresco of the Cardinal Virtues from the Stanza della Sagnatura in the Vatican. On the ceiling of one chapel, an Annunciation after Raphael. On another, his Road to Calvary, which is now in the Prado Museum in Madrid. The Expulsion from Eden from the Vatican Loggia. Carved as a bas-relief, one of Raphael's early designs for the painting of the Entombment of Christ. No artist has been more devotedly admired or more royally enshrined. But where has it left the real Raphael? Today we have to search for him again and rediscover for ourselves in our own terms an art which did inspire so many generations before us.